Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, wants to change the school syllabus to include lessons in gay history. He's pledged that a Labour government would add it to the curriculum so that children were aware of the achievements of figures such as World War II codebreaker Alan Turing and poet Oscar Wilde. But do children need to be taught about LGBT history in the classroom? Or is it a topic that's better left for them to discover themselves? Well, joining us to discuss this is editor of Gay Star News, Tris, is that how I pronounce it? Tris Reed Smith, and former teacher turned education consultant Chloe Comby. Hello to you. Thank you for joining us. Tris, make your case.
Very simply, when I was a kid and learning about, say, Tennessee Williams in A-level and studying his plays, I wasn't allowed to be told that he was gay. I wasn't allowed to discuss his sexuality. And that makes no sense. We're not talking about indoctrination here. We're talking about education. And actually improves the quality of education if, when you're talking about the Emperor Hadrian, you can know about his love life. It was an important factor in his life. It improves the importance of that. And there are, forget just history, it's about all sorts of aspects of our culture. I mean, physics, Sir Isaac Newton, there were rumours about his sexuality. He may well have been gay. And by knowing that, you know more. And we should be providing a full education for our children, not a censored education.
Chloe.
I agree to an extent. I think it's absolutely right and necessary to include, LGBT people in all kinds of education. There have been, enormous contributions. I'm just not necessarily sure we need to identify the fact that they kind of are LGBT. Obviously, if it's part of the story, that is important. But I don't think that when, we talk about, I don't know, Malcolm X or Shakespeare, their heterosexuality is not really the issue. So I'm not really sure that necessarily we have to make an issue of the individual sexuality. And it's that slightly kind of othering thing, which I think is kind of almost the wrong point to make to children, in that you're isolating the fact that this is a person who's LGBT. Do we need to do that? I'm not sure.
So, with respect to the othering thing, there's an assumption which most people make most of the time that most people are heterosexual. And by failing to identify that not everybody is, you can cause real problems. And it's certainly the case that in regards to Shakespeare's sonnets, there's a lot of debate about whether or not sexuality played a role in the way he wrote those and even who he was writing them to. And it is important, if you're going to study English literature properly, to understand that. And there are lots of people as well, like Sappho of Lesbos. You can't study her poetry at all without understanding that she was a lesbian. It wouldn't make any sense. So it is important.
But I don't think those things are being kind of disguised anymore. I think they come up and sort of bubble up naturally. I'm not sort of saying that you sort of censor those things. I'm just not necessarily sure in all cases you have to kind of make it this kind of central issue. And I know Jeremy Corbyn was talking about how, having this kind of gay month. Why not have kind of all these amazing gay individuals sort of woven into the fabric of the curriculum, the same way you should have writers of colour or female writers? I just don't think these months dedicated to those particular things, and what I actually think in the end it does in the end is kind of remove, sort of denormalise it, right, and makes it a point that it's gay male or whatever. Why not have them as represented as kind of heterosexual writers or male writers, for the perhaps the writers that children are more familiarised with. That I just think that should be the focus more than making them individual months.
The advantage of a month is it makes sure that people focus on something, and this is something new. But you're quite right that actually this should be part of everyday education all the time where it is relevant, and it often is. So I agree with that aspect of it. I do think that it's important more times than you might imagine to understand it, and that there is a natural censorship which takes place. And it's important for government to set national policy. What I think it's important then is for the teachers as professionals to decide what should be taught exactly in the classrooms. And I would leave it very much up to the teacher's individual judgment within that framework.
I think a lot of teachers are now, and I don't think there is that censorship. And I think this kind of discussion does, to some extent, really underestimate modern school children. Nothing's perfect, and we still have places to go. But for the most fact, modern school children are very, very cool with sexuality, and they have no issues with people being gay or transgender or lesbian or what have you. And I think that those, if you are in the classroom, which I often am, that those debates kind of naturally bubble up in a really, really positive way. So to actually frame a debate or frame an individual as this is an LGBT writer or actor or scientist isn't really the issue. And in some ways, does that kind of diminish their achievements? Because you know, that they're not exceptional because of their sexuality. They're exceptional because of that kind
When
of
you read more into their works, doesn't it become more obvious what their sexuality is anyway?
It becomes obvious, but unless it's overt, you don't necessarily know it's there. And just back to the point about kids being cooler these days, they definitely are, and the younger generations are far more accepting than older people often are, and if you look at the broad demographics of it. But despite that, that's so gay as a pejorative statement is one of the most common forms of bullying in schools. First or second most common in a lot of schools. So we actually do still need to tackle this overtly. And that bullying, when based on homophobia, transphobia, it doesn't just harm a person who's bullied, it harms the bullier, and it harms the whole school, disrupts the whole school, and it prevents education. So actually, while you're quite right that a lot of younger people are a lot better around these issues, and better in many cases than the older generations, there is still something to tackle there.
No, I agree. I mean, please, you know, don't take away from this that I'm saying that we shouldn't, you know, encourage and have these discussions about that. I'm just not sure it should be the focus. I think it should be part of the kind of collective focus of educating children, and that should be a really important element of it, but not this sort of thing that's somehow singled out.
I don't think that you need to single it out. I definitely think you need to integrate it into the whole education system. And so it's discussed when you're talking about religion, when you're talking about science, when you're talking about history, and when you're talking about literature. It always has to be part of a conversation. So, yeah, I'm definitely with you that it should be part of a day-to-day conversation in schools, not a segregated out conversation.
And that's exactly, I think it is that natural thing. And if it's in the context of the whole discussion, rather than being singled out as the debate, I think it kind of does naturalise the whole thing rather than...
Which was my point.
Yeah. So I think essentially we're kind of agreeing, but not on all points. But yeah.
And also, does it not depend which subject we're talking about as to the importance of the sexuality of the person we're discussing?
It certainly makes a difference. I mean, I used an example of a physicist, Sir Isaac Newton, earlier, and you can obviously discuss his scientific knowledge and what he gave to the world from that point of view without knowing about his sexuality. However, to understand his sexuality and how that was oppressed and what the impact that had on his life is an important part of his story. So I think that, you know, it does vary. It's obviously more important maybe for someone like Oscar Wilde than it is, or Alan Turing arguably, than it is for some other characters we might look at. So yes.
Yeah, I think particularly in things like history, because obviously, you know, we're in 2016, but it's very different 50 years ago or 100 years ago. And as you say, sort of Alan Turing style or Oscar Wilde's stories are incredibly tragic, and their sexuality and what happened to them as a result of their sexuality is very much integral to those their stories, and very, very important to teach in terms of, you know, the progression that we kind of keep continuing with. So I do think, obviously, if you're teaching things like history and philosophy and sociology, the issues of kind of sexuality and gender will naturally come up more than perhaps they will in like design and technology, maybe.
Good to talk to both of you. Thanks very much indeed for making your points. We appreciate it. Thank you. Still to come on the programme for